Hi, good afternoon, and happy Friday to all of my fellow classified professionals that are joining us today. Thank you for joining us for our last session of the semester in our anti-racism seminar series for classified professionals. My name is Andrea Torres. I'm a classified senator, and I also serve on the Classified Senate Professional Development Committee, along with Tiffany Martinez, who is here today assisting us on the chat. These seminars are part of a joint effort between the Classified Senate, the Student Equity Office, and Fresno City's faculty to demonstrate a commitment to anti-racism and to improve the communication between staff, faculty, students, and administrators. So as a reminder, these sessions are being recorded and they are going to be posted to the FCC Professional Development YouTube page, along with any previous seminars that you may have missed. If you'd like to rewatch this one or any past sessions that we have, you will be able to find them there. During this session, we encourage you to ask questions or provide comments throughout this presentation, and you can do that by using the Q&A feature on the right side of your screen in the Attendee Hub. They can be anonymous, but what we really want to do is encourage you to use this space to ask those questions and take advantage of the resources that our presenter is bringing you today. Today, our presenter is Erik Escovedo, who is a professor here at Fresno City College, and he teaches American Indian Studies. This happens to be Erik's first year of teaching with Fresno City, but he is not a stranger to our campus. Prior to that, he was one of our students, and he was an active member of the Native American Intertribal Student Association. I'm not going to take all of his introduction away from him, and I'll let him give you some of that in just a moment. But today, what Erik is going to present on is the topic of anti-racism, performative versus actionable policy and practices. And this will be an introduction into how identity performative or how to identify performative policies and practices that may not benefit marginalized communities or create an environment of true equity. So with that, Erik, we thank you for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. Dagote shi Erik Gonze, Shima Ende, Shima Radamuri. I am speaking my indigenous language and introducing myself. I'd like to welcome you guys here in this space. My name is Erik Escovedo. My pronouns are he, him, his, and like to acknowledge uh, the tribal communities here of the Central San Joaquin Valley, the Yokuts and Mono tribes, and to give thanks for them for all their sacrifice for us to be here on this land. And I like to always acknowledge and honor them before I begin these type of trainings and talks. So a little bit of background on my education. Yes, I am alumni here from Fresno City College. Left here with studying American Indian Studies and art. So essentially, I was a double major, and I was a part of the land acknowledgement, the monument that sits on Fresno City College in the Yokuts Plaza, which is a part of campus that is dedicated to the local American Indian community, and marks it's definitely way for the college to pledge their strive towards creating an equitable environment here on the college campus. So from there, here at Fresno City College, I went to Fresno State, and my bachelor's is in American Indian culture and art. I was the first student to graduate at Fresno State with a bachelor's that included American Indian Studies, and my graduate degree is in art, and my graduate thesis was on decolonization and intergenerational trauma in American Indian communities. So, equity and anti-racism is something I'm thoroughly familiar with, striving towards that as a student and as a community member, but also to try to create that environment here now as a colleague on this campus, as a professional. So I'm really thankful for being here today and thankful for the opportunity, and thanking those of you who are here on a Friday um, and are spending time when you could be somewhere else doing something maybe a little more preferable, but you're here learning about more equitable practices and how to identify. Really, what today's going to be is about identifying anti-racism and rate, and what policies and practices look like that help encourage a community of anti-racism and equity, and learning what the differences are between performative versus actionable practices and policies here on campus. And I do know that some of you may not work directly with the students or may not be in positions that make those type of decisions, but you can definitely be in support of those decisions and all have a role in creating an equitable environment here, whether it's with your coworkers, if you work in the back office, or if you're the face that people first see when they walk into a division office, or if you're the first face a student sees when they walk into financial aid and they have questions. All these different areas are important when it comes to creating an equitable environment. And so I just want to say that some of the content I present today you may not feel like it's targeting what you do specifically, but I think we all stand, and I say we because I learned myself each time I teach these types of lessons that I pick up something from the base that I'm talking to. And I do want to encourage that you interject yourself every so often and ask questions. And I will challenge you guys to try to step out of your comfort zones and ask maybe even some difficult questions. And this isn't a place, you don't have to worry about this being a place where you're going to be judged. I do know that talking about anti-racism can be uncomfortable because it's talking about racism. And sometimes that is even going to take introspective work and looking at where we can make improvements as individuals. So I encourage you to ask the difficult questions, and really, I'll do my best to answer them. And if I can't, I'll be honest with you that I can't. I'm not going to pretend that I know everything, and as I'm still learning my blind spots and trying to create an equitable environment. And so, with that being said, I'm going to share screen and get started with the actual PowerPoint presentation. Okay, great. Let's get started. All right. So, anti-racism, performative versus actionable policy and practices. So, defining anti-racism is a difficult task. One of the main reasons why I feel that it's difficult is because the complexities of racism itself, we oftentimes try to narrow it down to a few different practices and behaviors and policies, but it's very complicated and painful history. And so, as you see here from the little picture I included, right, it says recognizing racism in America. That's the beginning, and this person's already tired, and the person helping them up this hill, right, saying doing something about it, right, because first it's getting over the denial that racism still exists and still affects people today, because we oftentimes try to relegate racism and institutional racism to the past. And really, it's something that still affects us day to day. And I know that we've seen it within the wake of the social justice movement and with the killing of George Floyd. But these things have been here, they've never went away. And I know that a lot of people are getting racial fatigue, right? And this is what you're seeing with the individual with the hands on the knees is they're tired, not realizing that there's a lot more work to do. So I just would encourage you, like as we go through this definition, to just realize that it's not a simple thing to define. And my definition of anti-racism, what I've learned through my academic journey, isn't the solid number one definition. It's a working definition. It's something that's communal that we can contribute. But it's definitely one thing I can say is that to be anti-racist, to practice anti-racism is not a passive experience. It's definitely something you need to be active in. It's something to do something about. So my two little bullet points here in the first slide, right? It says try not to think of anti-racism as something you can neatly define, just like racism, anti-racism is multifaceted. To put this into perspective, let's explore our understanding of racism. So I'll go to the next slide. So there's different modes of racism, right? And I included this little chart right here from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And what you're seeing is the cycle, right, of how institutional racism works. But in the middle, this little chart, what you're seeing is how it starts. So it's internalized racism, right? Race-based beliefs and feelings within individuals, because it is something that we first have to internalize before we can even express it. That goes with everything, not just the concept of racism, but just every type of belief and value system we develop. It has to be internalized. It has to be taught to us. Um, Once that happens, then once we get a little older and we go into something like grade school, right, we start learning interpersonal communication and how to communicate with the outside world. And things like bigotry and biases that are demonstrated to us, right, really solidify concepts of stereotypes, of cultural biases, all these different things that we have internalized now become a part of our interpersonal interactions with one another and how we treat one another, and also to how we see how people, what we call people of power, people in positions of authority may treat others, right? And so all these things are demonstrated to this. And when I say people in power, it's also people like your parents, right, or your family members, or an uncle, or a cousin that you may look up to, right, and how they've internalized the dynamics of race and how they express that, the way they treat people and how they talk to you about it. So once that affects your interpersonal communication, then you look at it how it's demonstrated on an institutional level, right, with discriminatory practices and policies, right, within organizations and institutions like the public school system. And I'll get into a little bit of some examples of that a little later on. But I just want to say something about the institutional level from an indigenous perspective. You see how colonization has affected indigenous communities as far as how the government in the United States, in particular, treats the tribes that reside within the continental United States. These discriminatory policies like forced removal, forced assimilation, like the Indian boarding schools, is really tied into how Native Americans view the public school system and even community colleges for that matter, or colleges in general. There's a huge historic mistrust that was built through the traumas of institutional policies and practices. And then you get to the systemic level, right? The ongoing racial inequities and maintained by society, right? Because then this becomes something where it's within the entire system, that's within the electorate, the individuals like yourselves, like ourselves, I should say, right? We go and vote for politicians who create the policies that reinforce, or they're either going for or against policies that perpetuate um, racist behavior or racist institutional practices, right? They create these policies. And it really starts at the internalized level. Are you someone who's been brought up in a way that is going to challenge some of these norms, right? And really fight for a country that has anti-racist practices and policies and equitable racism policies? Because really what anti-racism is about is creating a level of equity, right? Because we're challenging the racial systemic norms. So right here in the bullet points, it has the individual racism. So I'm going to reiterate some of the things I already talked about when looking at this chart right here. This so it says individual racism refers to the beliefs, attitudes, and actions of individuals that support or perpetuate racism in conscious and unconscious ways. So just remember, sometimes like we have these unconscious biases that may um, perpetuate some of the racist things that we think about, and not just racism. We can break it down to prejudices as well. Just things that we may not even be aware of that we're doing to perpetuate different types of racist behaviors. Maybe not in ourselves. Maybe we're, maybe being passively complicit, right? And the acts of racism, even within the discussions at home with family during Thanksgiving or something, right? And so, like, how are we perpetuating racism in these ways on the individual level within just ourselves or our family, our friends? And then you get move on to the next level, institutional racism, and it's referring to discriminatory treatments, unfair policies, or biased practices based on race that result in equitable outcomes for whites over people of color, and are extended considerably beyond just prejudice, right? These things are not just a personal opinion or your prejudgments of one another anymore. These things are actually affecting the um, the access to resources, for example, right? If you look at the Jim Crow era laws, and if you look at redlining in particular, right, it's preventing certain groups from buying real estate in certain parts of the city. And so I'll challenge that norm a little bit more, because then you're thinking about, well, redlining is cutting up land, but who were the original land stewards, for example, right? And that takes a level of cultural competency that most people don't have, because then we're talking about American Indian rights to land, right? the way treaties work, taking away land, and with settler colonialism and the encroachment of land and resources, and who paid the price were the American Indians. So that's a step even above understanding where redlining comes from, right? This institutional racism goes way beyond what most of us really understand, but it takes the desire to learn more about what's going on. And it's not an easy thing to learn about, especially in today's society, again, where we have that racial fatigue. So let me move on to the last bullet point, which is systemic racism, which is referring to whites' historical systemic oppression of non European groups that manifest in the structure and operation of racist societies like the United States. It is reflected in disparities regarding wealth, income, criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, education, and amongst other factors. So it is everywhere. It's these practices are everywhere because of the internalized racism, the interpersonal, right? Because of the way that racist ideology has grown and is essentially a part of the way the United States was developed because of slavery, right? Because of the way that they treated American Indians and also to all the immigrants that came in. And it's important to point out because it does say in this little thing, I did put non-European groups, or but it's important to point out that European groups as well, the Irish, the Italians, and amongst other ethnic European groups, were also treated very poorly when they first arrived, right? So there's this xenophobia that extended beyond just a racial group. But at the end of the day, they were not considered part of the white race, and that's where assimilation and the attainment of white privilege comes into play. I'll digress from that point because that's a whole other conversation. But simply, it's just to point out that all these different groups were targeted for specific reasons, right? And they were othered. They were not part of the dominant culture, and the dominant culture ensured through policy and practice ways to keep them othered and keep them away from accessing resources or housing or healthcare, all these different things that people from dominant culture get to enjoy. So when it's on a systemic level, that's when the real work we have our work cut out for us, and the real work really begins at the internalized level and looking within ourselves and not a way to like beat yourselves up or to make yourselves feel bad or to create guilt, but really just to have ownership and trying to elevate and become a better human being. And for some people, they may not feel that learning about anti-racism or trying to create equitable environments, maybe that's not a part of their system values, and that's I wouldn't say that's okay, but that's up to them. I'm definitely not here to try to hammer in my value system or thoughts about anti-racism into any individual. But if you're looking at trying to create an equitable environment, then you need to be look in and do the work that's required. So the question is, what is anti-racism, right? Well, right here, I like these. This I remember when these were all the rage back in the day, where they would pick a particular term, right, and people would type in other keywords that would highlight, so it's essentially a word collage, right? Of and whatever words popped up the most would be bigger, and the words that would come up least would be the smaller words, right? But you see things in this anti-racism graphic: justice, tolerance, behavior, change, minorities, diversity, inclusion. These things that we hear at nauseum sometimes, right? In educational institutions. And the reason why I use the word at nauseum because sometimes it gets to the point where it's like, okay, I've heard this over and over again, but like, where are the real changes, and where is this becoming something what we call performative? Is it just a mantra that the institutions like to state in order to feel good about themselves or to check boxes, or is it something that's being put into action, right? So anti-racism, in order to be anti-racism, you can no longer be passive. You have to be active, right? You have to be an active, what we consider an active ally. So some of the points I put right here is that recognizing and working to eliminate racist practices, structures, and policies and beliefs in all levels of society and its institutions. So when I mean at all levels, right, is at the smaller levels, right? If it's just in your workplace, or maybe maybe like for me when I worked in parks and recreation, right? But maybe I had someone in there that had some type of prejudice against the black kids that would come to the park. If I ever encountered that, I would have to address that on that level, right? That's a small level of an institution because it's parks and recreation. It's a public institution, but this person doesn't feel that this particular group needs access to it, or they don't deserve the access because they don't quote behave themselves, right? That's something that I would have to address and recognize and try to figure out a way to eliminate that type of like practice and behavior, right? Or belief system. So it starts at that level, right? And then, that's why we have trainings like this, right? The next part says identifying the ways in which the white race benefits from said groups and institutions at the cost of other racial groups and working to change them. So how do you identify the ways that are we're that people are benefiting when I say the white race, right? And again, this is going to be uncomfortable conversation because we're talking about race. And this isn't me being anti-white. It's just putting out the fact that white folks do more often than not benefit from the institutions. The systems were built for you. Think about all the legislation that's been created, all the First Amendments, the Bill of Rights, that were meant not to include a lot of different people, and a lot of the policies that are put out, like the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Right, that was a policy that was made to forcefully remove Native people from their land, regardless of their treaties they had signed with the federal government, which led to the Trail of Tears. But you want to fast forward, let's fast forward because that's ancient history, right? And I talked about how racism is relegated to the past, right? So let's identify something that's more current. Something more current would be the 1978 American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which finally, after what is that, 202 years of this country being in existence, gave American Indians the right to practice religious freedom that was not granted and bestowed upon the nation's first people, right? That's within my lifetime. I was born in 1981. My mother, my uncles, even some of my cousins were not allowed to practice their religious rights if they wanted to practice as far as indigenous religious practices, right? Spiritual practices and ceremonies. And for some tribes, they were not even allowed to access their sacred sites. In a country that preaches about being founded on religious freedom, the pursuit of those freedoms, right? In our lifetimes, we see that there was legislation that needed to be put in place in order to deconstruct a system that harmed Native American identity, right? So these systems, these institutions did not benefit American Indians. So that's why we have to bring up this uncomfortable talk about white privilege. So that's a part of the identifying these issues, right? And then there's raising awareness on how racism impacts people of color, right? I just gave you an example with the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, right? And it says, the end of this says the limits of our country's ability to become a better place for all its citizens, right? It's raising awareness. It's having this, again, questioning what's going on inside of you first, and having, I guess, those uncomfortable self discussions. I don't know, like in your inner monologue, and really trying to hold yourself accountable first, right? And it isn't, again, in a way to beat yourself up or make you feel guilty, but just really saying, hey, you know what, I'd like to improve on this. Maybe this isn't the correct way of looking at a group, or ignoring, policy that's been harmful to groups of color. Okay. So then it is recognizing how racism is more than a personal belief system, right? But rather an indoctrination system of an essential part of American history. I went over aspects of way American Indians were treated back in the early times of the United States, right? With President Andrew Jackson and the Indian Removal Act, the Trail of Tears. It continues to go on through the 1860s, the wars in the Great Plains area with the Lakota people. If you look at the Treaty of Fort Laramie, if you look at the Apache resistance in Geronimo, and the fact when he surrendered, they still imprisoned him, and all the way over there in Florida. And even the people who helped find Geronimo, the Apache scouts, they were imprisoned, even though they were trying to assimilate and help the white culture, right? This these these systems have been along for a long time, and the indoctrination system, right? The perpetuation. And I'm only speaking from an indigenous point of view because that's the scope of my study and part of my identity, right? And so I'm bringing that indigenous perspective here to you guys today, and saying that there's other systems of indoctrination. Think about the stereotypes you have about American Indians, the noble savage, right? Usually thinking about American Indian, think about the feathers in their hair, right? You think about most of us having long hair, and having a certain limited amount of ceremonies like the powwow or the dream catcher. This iconography that's been used to indoctrinate people into believing that Native Americans, for one, are a thing of the past, and for two, were primitive people without really recognizing the fact of the matter is that we were not primitive people, and we had been here for over tens of thousands of years, and we've developed such a diverse amount of cultures. And this indoctrination system has led most people to believe that that's not the case. And it is an essential part of American history, American folklore, the cowboys and Indians perspective. When you dehumanize people and dwindle them down to a few stereotypes, you're most likely not going to vote. You're not going to care if you vote for somebody that may have anti-Indian policies in mind, threatening tribal sovereignty, for example. And so that's why, like, this indoctrination and the historical part of America, like how we treat groups here, it's important to recognize these things, right? After you recognize them, it's acknowledging how it shapes society, both in obvious and subtle ways. In an obvious way, right, is just the way if you look at a few years ago, the no DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, the water protectors over there in Standing Rock, and they were fighting against, multi-corporate, more multinational corporations and with oil, and the federal government did nothing to step in and intervene and stop these people from being harmed, right? That's the way society is shaped. Is like we sometimes just turn the blind eye when people are really fighting for true social justice and justice not only for human beings but for the elements as well. And we rely on water to live, right? It's a practical thing, but it's something that we need to acknowledge is like how that's an obvious way, right? But what about subtle ways? What about, things that we don't really think about, like enrollment numbers for Native Americans in colleges, right? What does that look like? How underserved are they being? What's the visibility of resources for Native Americans on campuses? How are they seeing themselves here, right? How are other great groups seeing themselves here, right? So then there's the whole working part, right? When we looked at the first graphic and it's like doing something about it, it was learning about it, then doing something about it, right? So how are you working to dismantle racist systems and institutions? And sometimes that word is like really triggering for people. Like you talk about dismantling something, right? It's like, well, you're going to destroy things that benefit me. It's like not necessarily talking about like completely destroying something, but reworking it, right? Where it can be equitable and be something that's viable for everybody who chooses to pursue, for example, a higher education, right? So this whole anti-racism thing is it's a big giant process because racism itself is a big giant process, right? It's a system that has different levels, and anti-racism is the same way. But it's just important to point out the distinction between the two, besides it being one's racist and one's anti-racism, is that you can be in order for racism to survive and be perpetuated, most people can just sit on their hands and do nothing. They can just simply state that I am not racist. Therefore, they're not perpetuating racist behaviors. And you may not be the ones that are. When I say you, I'm speaking generally. I'm not calling anyone out in this space. But when individuals realize that, they think, well, I'm not the one making racist remarks or racist jokes if it's on that level, or I'm not the one that's shooting unarmed black men or blocking people of color being hired in certain institutions, right? Like you may not be ones doing it, but if you're not doing anything about it, then you become passively complicit in acts of racist policies and practices. And again, this isn't me trying to call anyone out. It's to call you in to a conversation and say, well, how can, if you can deem yourself not racist, then how can we get you over to be anti-racist, right? How can we get you over to be active and help strive for a better world for everybody? Because, you know, if once we all get on a level of benefiting from resources, then you have like true equity. But the fact of the matter is, it's not something we have today. And it really takes all hands on deck. It takes a big effort from everyone to really change and dismantle and rebuild these systems to benefit everybody. So, performative practices. So, now let's get into what that looks like when you're actually initiated and understand anti racism or equity, right? Well, one thing I want to point out is virtue signaling. I know that's become like a pejorative, but really there's something about virtue signaling that we need to come to terms with both if you're more lean on more on the conservative side or you lean on more of the liberal side, right? Um, so expressing support about a cause or specific social issue without investing any real effort or sacrifice to create necessary change, right? So we have this person holding up the BLM sign right here, right? Taking a selfie. It's like really what they're doing is creating a platform on the backs of oppressed people, and that's not really obviously it's not really healthy, right? It's virtue signaling. It's taking the plight of others and creating something that benefits you as an individual. That's unhealthy, that's performative, and it's actually harmful. So the other graphic I have right here, this image of Jerry Jones, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, kneeling with the Cowboys, right? The whole football team. This whole issue that came about with Colin Kaepernick protesting police brutality and taking a knee. He lost his whole entire career and sacrificed that, right? That's not performative. That's actionable. He sacrificed his job in order to make a voice and create a platform for people who are talking about police brutality, right? Which is an age old thing. And when it was safe to protest, this is when you see people like Jerry Jones kneeling, right? Because it's safe, it's acceptable. And oftentimes, when something's safe and acceptable, when it comes to anti-racism, then that means that it's perpetuating racism. And so really you need to be brave and take that stance. And I think if Jerry Jones would have done this in the beginning or even spoke out as a team owner to help Colin Kaepernick and say, you know what, we support his cause. Maybe Colin Kaepernick would still have his job and be able to talk about, the injustices when it comes to police brutality, especially attacking our fellow African American peoples here in the country, right? So, second bullet point says including words like diversity and equity in mission statements without actual diversity in all areas of the institution. So, like, let's take the college, right? Because this is a college setting right now that we're talking at, right? So, what does that look like? So, for you look at the mission statements when it says diversity, it might be on, like posters hung up on campus and some people's offices, right? But like if you're like on a level, let's say like, and it's not the case, here at Fresno City College, you do a really good job of having qualified, a qualified, diverse group of people in each facet of the school, right? Within the administrative level, we have a very diverse group with faculty, with staff. We have diversity here, right? It could improve, but the fact of the matter is there's still representation of qualified individuals in these different entities on campus, right? So that's where diversity is actually no longer a performative word. It's actually becoming actionable. Equity, right? Looking at all blind spots. And I can speak from the perspective of as an indigenous person and knowing that the school has a lot of work, still has a lot of work to do, including myself, because I am now part of the institution. I have to hold myself accountable and looking at ways that we can improve things for and resources and policies here for our indigenous students, our American Indian students, because we are the smallest population. Oftentimes, people focus on numbers and they, well, why are we going to invest resources into you when you're only a small part of the population? And it's like, well, wait, if we're talking about equity, you need to consider the fact of the matter is like you're not going to grow a group unless you invest resources into them. So it's a situation where if you're not really in the practice of true equity, it's a performative statement that you're putting within the institution. Looking at the last point, it says tokenizing people of color to demonstrate the presence of diversity. And so I'm often reluctant to do these presentations because in other places, like at Fresno State, when I was a student employee there, I was tokenized a lot of the time. In order to demonstrate the presence of diversity, I would be asked to do a Native American blessing, right, for example. And there was certain part of my journey there at Fresno State where I realized, you know what, like I'm happy to be a part of this, but like, is it just to demonstrate that there's Native American support, or are you really going to throw some resources and talk about issues that affect me as an Indigenous student and the Indigenous community and broad? Are you doing things to bring them in and create a presence stronger for Native American students on campus? Is there real visibility there, or is it only visibility when it's there to demonstrate diversity? And so that's performative. If it's just me singing a song, but there's no representation on the administrative level or even really on the faculty level of that campus, it's like, what are you really doing for Native students? to see themselves there in these spaces, giving them something to aspire to, right? So tokenization is definitely performative and actually really damaging. So that's why I said, like, it's like I knew this discussion was going to be important, and I really think that the nation has done a really good job with all these anti-racist seminars on trying to take away tokenization and really bringing in qualified people to have these difficult discussions. So I'll digress from that point and move on to the next slide. So performative policy, right? So here's a policy that's been going around, right? The in vogue thing of land acknowledgement, right? So right here in my first bullet point says an example of performative policy is mandating land acknowledgement statements on college campuses, but not directing any resources to the indigenous communities that have suffered loss of land. Native American students are amongst the most underserved groups. And that even speaks here to Fresno City College. Now, there's efforts, and I really appreciate it. And I want to say that there are efforts to improve the relations between tribal communities and the college. And I'm thankful for it. And I'm here to help do the work. And I'm thankful for those that have advocated for that. But with that being said, the fact of the matter is that it's still a lot of work that needs to be done on that level. And these type of land acknowledgements, right? Which I picked one that was from outside California. And right here, looking at the Comanche, Wichita, Kickapoo ancestral land. And it's like, great, you're acknowledging them. But essentially, what a land acknowledgement is doing is saying, yeah, we took your land and we acknowledge that we did. And it's just like, well, how's that true? How's that true equity, right? Well, we're also making an effort to repatriate a portion of our campus to the indigenous groups to use that part of the land as they see fit, right? Maybe having an area dedicated for Native communities to come together to have ceremony on college campus. That's a start. Or directing resources and recruitment and financial aid to reach out to Native American students and or even programs or counselors like we have here, right, with the RAIN program. Shout out to Alexandra Gonzalez, doing great work in the RAIN program, serving Native students and making sure they get through college because it's a challenging place to be, right? These are now moving on performative policies and going to actionable, right? So I got a few stats because I know as a presenter and as an educator, I need to bring in stats because people like stats. So here are the only stats you're really going to see throughout this presentation. And it's about Native American students in higher education. First bullet point in the stats area says because Native Americans, both American Indians and Alaska Natives, comprise less than 1% of 24% of 18 and 24-year-olds. Native American students are enrolled in college compared, right? So the Native American students 18 to 24 years old, only 24% of them, right? So 1% of the entire school population, right, of all Native American students, right? And of that 1% of Native American students, 24% of them are 18 to 24-year-olds. So that means that there's students that are older. So more students, so that's what 76% of Native students are over the age of 24. Why is that? Right? Well, there's obviously a systemic issue going on with that. And what is higher education doing to address that issue? What are they doing to aggressively recruit and present um, things that appeal to Native American students to bring them into the college environment at an earlier age? Right? How are we failing this particular group, knowing that? And it's great that 70%, 76% of that 1% of college students are over native college, college students are over the age of 24 years old. And I'm one of them. I graduated or transferred from Fresno City College at the age of, I think I was 33 at the time. I was much older. And so it's nice. It's nice to have the opportunity. But at the same time, what are we doing to get students in earlier, right? And getting them on that track of success at an earlier age. So that's just one stat for you. And then the other one, undergraduate enrollment amongst Native Americans aged 18 to 24 decreased from 128,600 in 2016 to 17. It had decreased to 116,400. That's a substantial drop, right? We're not talking about a small number. We're talking about over 12,000 students dropped, right? That's a drop. That's a deep decrease because we're 12,000 students out of 128,000. That's a substantial drop. That's a percentage number that would, in any other group, if that happened, they would be really aware and say, we need to do something about this, right? But this is not the case for Native Americans. This lack of visibility on campuses really creates an apathy at times, and I'll use that callous word, an apathy towards American Indian communities because they only account for 1% of the college population. And it's like, well, if you want to see that number grow, if you care about it, and if that's your justification for not directing resources, well, then you got to realize like the only way that number grows and the only way we can meet that justification is that you do invest. So the last little bullet point says that Native American students are more likely to attend public versus private institutions in higher education. 79% of Native American students attended public 2 or 4 year institutions in 2019. 79% of our population, of Indigenous population, attend public schools, right? Which is great. Fresno City College, I love Fresno City College. I love working here. That's why I'm here, because it gave me and my family and my community an opportunity to strive to do better things. I'm here as a college professor now. I have a friend who graduated with me. He's in the PhD program at UC Davis. Community colleges gave us that. With that being said, wouldn't it be nice if we can get into the Ivy Leagues, right? Of these private institutions, if there was more access for Native students, right? And some of these institutions may have a land acknowledgement, but they have no Native students on the campus. Or even that, if they have Native students, maybe they have no Native faculty or admin, right? It's still this invisibility and this lack of effort on these institutions to aggressively recruit different groups, in particular the Native American community. Let's go on to the next slide. So, how do we shift from performative to actionable? Right, good question. How do we do this? Right, that hill, right, that hill. We're starting to track up the hill. Um, well, in order to shift the institution from performative to actionable policy and practice, there needs to be an acceptance that the institution still benefits from systemic inequities that fail to provide marginalized groups with the resources necessary to bring upon actual equity, right? And I gave you the example of Native American students. Now that's something that's being changed, thankfully. And I'm proud of that. I'm proud to work in an institution that is making the steps that it has for a long time, by the way. It's a slow process, but it's still being done. I'm so appreciative and so grateful for that. But just because we're getting a little bit of progress doesn't mean the work stops, right? We need to still fully accept and recognize that there's still benefits that are the institution is still benefiting off of systemic inequities, right? The fact that this campus does sit on native land, right? But that's a whole other discussion about repatriation of native land. So I'll digress from that point. Next bullet point says the level of accountability needs to begin within individuals. I've talked about this already, right? Individuals who work for the institutions. This is achieved by having difficult conversations and introspective moments that challenge internalized beliefs of race, gender, sexuality, etc. Right? We need to really have these introspective moments and really look at ourselves. It isn't about me calling you out or anything like that. It's just really just presenting you with this information and seeing where maybe some of your blind spots are at or some areas that you can improve on. Right? So then the next one says, it's important to know that everybody has work to do when it comes to biases, including myself. I was just having a conversation in this particular room before all of you attendees were allowed in about my blind spots when it comes to people with special needs and people who need resources like us, like interpreters, right, for sign language, right, for that group of people, right, or groups of people who are suffering from anxiety, like non-visible challenges and disabilities, right? I still have a lot of work to do in that area, and I wouldn't necessarily call them biases, but maybe it is. Maybe I'm under the assumption because someone doesn't have a visible disability that they don't need help. That's something that maybe I need to work on, and I have been striving to do that, right? And that's not something that's not easy for me to admit, especially being the person that's conducting a workshop and a seminar on equity. But it's important that I show you that even I have work to do. Okay. Interpersonal communication needs to ensure that a level of accountability is openly reinforced in a productive manner, right? So to be actionable and to have a institution of anti-racism, I mean, the interpersonal communication needs to really happen in a way that's productive, though. Like, holding someone accountable for saying something that's maybe culturally insensitive, right? Like, I remember hearing when I was a student, I remember hearing someone on this campus saying, when we were trying to get the Yokuts Plaza done, they were in a committee and they turned and said to my mentor, Dr. Bernard Navarro, who was the American Indian Studies instructor at the time. They turned to him and said, "Is this going to?" And I heard them say it under their breath, and they didn't think I heard. And I was in that committee meeting as a student. I heard them say, "Is this really going to make a difference? Is this land acknowledgement? Is this monument really going to make a difference?" Well, it did make a difference. Look where I am at today, and look where multiple students are at today, right? But it would have been really nice if I would have heard that in the capacity that I am at now and the education I have now to pull that person to the side and have a conversation, a productive conversation about how, yeah, it actually will matter. It will make a change, right? These issues need to have a solution based approach. It isn't simply calling someone racist or calling someone prejudiced or ignorant. It's not just, that can't be the approach. It has to be solution based. Simply pointing and calling someone out and canceling them is not, it's not going to work for anybody. That's where something I actually agree with the attack on cancel culture. Like, I think if you're demonstrably unethical and you're spouting racist things, there's no avenue for you to come back on, then yeah, maybe you should be deplatformed and canceled. But if it's just someone who made a simple mistake, then we need to offer a solution based approach to rebuilding that relationship with whatever community they've unintentionally harmed or slandered, right? It's something they can should be able to come back to, and that goes within these institutions, right? So it's not only the work of bringing people in and educating them and making sure they're practicing, but also to the people who may be doing the work and they make these mistakes as well. Again, we have our blind spots, right? But once we get there and once we have these conversations and we're getting people, for the most part, I guess you can say, on the same page, then we can look at this as the systemic level and look at the institution and say, you know what, these resources really need to be directed more to this particular group. Or you know what, in financial aid, maybe we do need to have a cultural competency workshop on how to serve the Latinx students better and to reach their communities more, right? These are all different conversations that we can have, and they don't seem very harmful to me. These are very benign conversations to have. That's because maybe I recognize that there is need in different groups and that I'm already through that hurdle. And I already had these uncomfortable conversations, even introspective moments with myself, right? So yeah, to recap this little area, right? Make sure that you address that this institution still does benefit from systemic inequities, right? Make sure there's a level of accountability within yourself, and then push that out towards the institution. Have these introspective moments about race, gender, sexuality, etc., right? About identity. And know that, we all have, everybody, including the experts, quote unquote, have work to do when it comes to biases. And then again, this internal interpersonal communication, calling people, don't call them out, call them in. Have a conversation. So here's something that I like. This is something I pulled off of Twitter. It says, the beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racism. Anti-racist racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And that is the only way forward. Again, introspection starts there. And if you want to do the work, it's not going to be easy. But seldomly, right? The cliche seldomly is the correct way, the easy way. So I wanted to highlight some of the examples of anti-racist policy and practice here at City College, and I want to point to the programs that we have had in existence for a very long time. Again, that's why I'm thankful to been able to be at Fresno City College when I was trying to find my way in academia. Um, so some of the implementation of programs like SIMBA, Rising Scholars Puente, and the RAIN program, which I just talked about, right? The Resources for American Indian Needs. They're all great examples of how the college is actively pushing towards racial equity. The presence of qualified people of color in faculty, staff, and administration positions creates a level of visibility that encourages students and community to see themselves in an institution that was not created to benefit them in the beginning, right? And they start seeing people that they identify with in these positions. It gives them the motivation to step up and maybe become a student at Fresno City College, or at least support people in their community that are trying to go to school, right? They see themselves there and they realize, you know what, that place is for us. That place does want to help us. They're willing to meet us not only halfway, but sometimes really extend out further than halfway and pull us in and provide resources for the challenges that we have, right? This is where practice and policy really become actionable, right? It isn't just the policy of declaring, we now want you encourage faculty, staff, and admin to do a land acknowledgement every time, right? It's like going beyond the land acknowledgement. It's providing resources for Native students, but all the students in general that have challenges and that need the resources. And I know some of you work for these programs or may work for or have access or work for places of resources for students. You see these students. So it's incumbent upon you to maybe take a moral inventory and seeing, well, am I doing my part? Am I being, even if it's just smiling at someone that may not normally get smiles because they're stereotype and they're deemed as, like especially men of color, and I'm one of them, may be seen as like dangerous, right? Or doesn't belong in a space. And even as I'll be open with you guys, even as a faculty member, I've gotten questioned about why I'm in certain spaces on campus as a faculty member. And I'm not faulting those people for that. I get that I have a younger look, even though I'm 40. But I get that it also has to do with my identity. It has to do with me being a male of color, and the fact that I don't, dress in a tie every day. So I get the questioning, and I get it's a part of their job. But it's like, how can we get past those unconscious biases and really just try to be welcoming? Even if it's a question about are you supposed to be here, but do it in a way that isn't seem so discouraging. Like, well, you're asking me what I'm doing here. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe I don't belong in college in general. Why do you think the number of male students of color has dropped so much? Why we don't have retention rates for them or graduation rates aren't high? It's because they don't feel welcome in these places. So if you work in a place where you're seeing the students face to face, right? What are you doing? What's the actionable policy and practice that you're bringing in, right? And even if you don't have the power to put policy forward, what are your practices in the capacity of your job that are making these students feel welcome? Second to last bullet point says all members of Fresno City College community are stewards of racial equity and anti-racist practices and policy. This means that there's an opportunity to advocate for resources for those in need. Then it's incumbent upon you to step up and help. Last point: be an active ally. So questioning allyship, right? So here's a question I get a lot: like, well, how do I be an ally? Because I try, and and if I make a mistake, then people get mad at me. That shouldn't be the case, first of all. But let's look at some of the things I put here, right? So oftentimes it is difficult for individuals to take the step to become an quote active ally, not a passive ally. Not to simply say you post on social media like, oh, I stand with Black Lives Matter, but you're really not standing with them physically. It's just you just posting that, right? How to get beyond that, right? So typically, when a person is interested in transitioning from the comforts of passivity into the discomfort of active allyship, there are doubts and fears that naturally come up, and that's normal, right? And some of the questions that may occur, like, quote, here's a question you may ask yourself, like, do I know enough to become an ally? Maybe, maybe not. But the willingness to be open enough to learn, that's that's a good ally. I am unsure if I can really get it while learning about the plight of others, right? And yeah, you may not get it. And I caution those who learn a little bit and or don't think that you know everything about a group of color. Don't put yourself in the place where you're an active ally, but you're starting to take opportunities away for people of color to speak for themselves. Unless there's a situation where a person of color, for example, is being attacked and they have no one in their corner, that's where you can become an active ally and help and be in their corner and stand up for them, right? And like that's part of the plight of others, right? You learn about their plight, right? And you start to get it after a while because you start being aware. You open up your awareness, and you're easily able to perceive when microaggressions happen, right? Another question says, "Am I am worried that I will be more offensive than helpful." Well, that's where people who are already in the practice of anti-racism and equity need to really look at themselves and say how they're helping these people who want to become potential allies, right? If they say something offensive, then you help them out. You say, hey, that's not really the correct way of doing it. I know sometimes it's hard because some things may be triggering, but if you come at them hard, then you're going to push these people away. These people who are worried that they're going to be more offensive than helpful, right? And if you're worried about that, I would say just try to find people around you that know a little more and figure out ways that you can become more of an asset than a detriment, right? One of the last questions is, what is the risk I am taking by standing up against the institutions or the norms that perpetuate disparities amongst racial groups? There is a risk, absolutely, especially if you're in an institution that isn't necessarily on the road to being progressive, right? What if you have people in levels of power where they're like, if you speak up on it, you're jeopardizing your job. And I'm not telling anyone here to jeopardize their job or anything like that, but I will say that like, it does take courage to stand up against these institutions, and it is not easy to do. It is not. These things put you at risk. I've put myself at risk. I've gotten in trouble as a student, thankfully, not as a professional, but I've been in spaces where um, people have targeted me because I've called them. At the time, I called them out. I should have called them in. I didn't know that yet, but you know, it was a risk I was willing to take to stand up for my community. I always use the metaphor: I was laying on the barbed wire for them to walk over my back and get through safely. Right? What risk are you willing to do as an ally? And are you doing it in a way that's you know that's in communion with the community that you're trying to help? Right? You don't simply take over and say, I know what's better for you. I'm going to do this. I'm going to speak for you instead of with you. Last bullet point in this slide says, remember that community grants your allyship. It isn't a title that you can bestow upon yourself. You can't just simply say, I'm an ally. Unless the community has designated you as that, you're not. You may be working towards that. You may be helping, but just remember that that's something that the community that you're trying to help, they get to decide whether or not you're part of the allyship. So some more things to consider. What kinds of considerations are we making when serving our community? Are we aware of the cultural and racial differences, right? Do you have enough cultural competency to correctly serve the community in whatever capacity you're in, right? Are we participating in colorblindness? Are we making the effort to acknowledge the differences that may or may not require specific approaches, right? For Native American communities, some of them have ceremonies that are 4 days long, and maybe like there was a deadline they were supposed to meet. Are you able to maybe finesse that deadline a little bit to accommodate this person's cultural practice, right? That's just an example of things that you can do, right? Or maybe they don't really understand the workings of college. Maybe you have the opportunity to help them out or direct them to a resource or a person that can, right? But it's recognizing that there's differences that come from specifically from their race or their ethnic background or cultural practices. Who are the people in the room making the decisions on the number of resources or types of policy that are supposed to help a group? Are there people when someone's making it, for example, when someone's making a decision to support Black students, are there Black people in the room helping making those decisions? Right? That representation is important. And is it going beyond just tokenism, right? Are they actual people with real power in these spaces when they're making decisions, right? And if you don't see that, then speak up on it. You know, are you in communion with the group that you're trying to advocate for? Or are you simply prescribing approaches without the input of the community? Again, including them into these spaces. Like, hey, they need to be brought in, not just simply for tokenism, but they need to have their vote needs to count just as much as our votes count, right? And not just one person, but more than one person. And also to ensure that they are qualified people, right? Not just simply be based off their identity, but they have some knowledge in what you're trying to work for. All right. And I get some of you are not in these spaces, you're not on committees, but just, maybe you have an opportunity to voice your opinion in a training or something, right? It's important. And the last bullet point on here is like, even if you're giving a seat to people of color, right? Do they have real power? Right? It's just reiterating that. Or is it tokenism? Let's stand in solidarity. Be brave. Have the courage to understand your own blind spots, courage to change yourself, and courage to positively advocate for change in others. Positively advocate for the change in others, right? Positively. Don't attack them. I don't think that's very constructive. What can you do in your professional capacity to advocate for anti-racist policy and practices, right? In your professional capacity, what can you do? Is it in the hiring processes? Is it in visibility issues? Is it in direct interaction with students in services like financial aid or recruitment? Are the programs and resources accessible to marginalized groups? Is it just being friendly to groups that are normally used to receiving welcoming attitudes in college settings? I just gave you an example of that, right? With men of color. Uh, second to the last bullet point, an example of solidarity would be creating an environment that ensures racist microaggressions are being called out in a productive manner. Calling people into conversations that aren't meant to attack a person in question. Be a teacher, not a preacher, right? Teach, don't preach. And remember, trying to do the right thing, uh, try to do the right thing even if it's not easy, okay? And it's not. This work is not easy. Thank you all for your time. So let me try to unshare this screen. All right, cool. That's it. Any questions?
Thank you, Eric. It takes a couple minutes for us to ask Susie for permission to unmute, so that's why there's an awkward delay sometimes. We did have one question that came in, and it is, can you explain the difference between calling someone out and calling someone in?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think most of us are familiar with call out culture. It's like when we like if we look at social media, for example, like how you screenshot someone's statement and then you post it on your page and you direct people to go attack them, right? That's calling them out. And really, like instead of doing that, you can call them into the conversation and say, "Hey," in social media, it's very toxic, so it's very hard to do that. But like if it's in the workplace, if it's on college campus, it's like maybe respectfully taking the opportunity to pull the person to the side and not in front of everybody, right? That's calling them in. You're calling them into the conversation and to having a conversation, either with yourself or someone else with you that can support you and really reiterate what you're trying to state to them. Um, yeah, like not aggressively just calling them out and saying, you're wrong. This is disrespectful. This is racist. You can point that out that it is racist and it's disrespectful, but in a way that this isn't going to cause them to double down or be defensive. It's really to say like, hey, you know what, you're the offender here, and if you so wish, there's ways that you can change that, and maybe you can work on that idea that you have that's really not productive to the conversation or practice or policy. Really just trying to calmly have the conversation with someone. That's calling them in is to have a conversation rather than a debate.
Thank you. We did have another one come in, and I'm going to go ahead and read it. Oh, there it goes. Minorities term is used to group a big diversity of students. In my opinion, each group faces different challenges. What challenges do Indigenous students face in enrolling and completing higher education?
um Good question. Well, yes, and of course, I agree with you. Right, when you use the term minority, you're giving a blanket statement and really not doing the work to acknowledge the differences. And I really appreciate that comment. Um, and the question, like, what are some of the challenges? Well, one of the big barriers I think really is just the lack of understanding what Indigenous people go through and what the historical trauma that they've had and they still store and what's been passed on from maybe some of their relatives who've gone through the boarding school systems, right? Is having that understanding that like Native American communities are very reluctant to trust within institutions, especially education. And so it's understanding that historical trauma and not just simply saying, oh, you're Native, you must have historical trauma, because that's not productive either. It's like really trying to like understand what the issues may potentially be and going in and asking if they have any of those issues, right? And that's I think we're sorely missing that on these campuses. Um, there's been steps within the past few years to really try to remedy that, but that's been some of the challenges. And again, like Native people not seeing themselves on campus, not seeing other Indigenous faculty, staff, and admin is discouraging because if as we all know, if you don't see people like yourself, then how can you picture you in those positions if there's no one to identify with, right? And so that's sorely missing in colleges too. These are some of the challenges, not to mention just the competency of our faculty sometimes and staff and admin. I was in the class here at Fresno City College, and my instructor, and I won't name names, but when I was there, he showed a movie that was a John Wayne movie, and John Wayne the whole time was saying racist stuff about American Indians and offensive things. And then the instructor himself said that attributed Native Americans for the spread of a specific disease, and it was demonstrably false information and outdated stereotype that he didn't choose to go in and make sure there's not up. He didn't do his due diligence as an academic to continue his research in his particular subjects and find out that that's old information and it was false. And another problem with Native American students and indigenous students is that um, a lot of these disciplines, um, sometimes they're outdated, and maybe people went through college 20 years ago and even 20, 25 years ago. And I'm not saying they're great, not great instructors, but sometimes there's blind spots and there's new data and there's new input from indigenous people who entered academia and have corrected some of the biases and some of the things that are just flat out wrong or racist in their specific disciplines. And you see that mending with the indigenous communities and academia coming within anthropology, for example. Anthropologists have become really good at understanding that for a long time, the othering of a community and studying them as a specimen rather as a people really did harm and misrepresented them. And they provided the data that informed politicians and people in power to put more policies together. They understand that there's a racist history with that, and sometimes I think academics fail to go back and see make sure there's new information about a particular topic regarding American Indians or how to serve American Indians or how to teach to American Indians. So I think that's those are some of the challenges. It's just a lack of cultural competency and the desire to learn some new things.
Thank you for that. So I don't see any other questions coming in right now. Remember, attendees, this is your opportunity to ask those questions. I was not even monitoring the chat because I was just so engaged in what you were saying, Eric. So I'm actually excited because you're doing a cultural competency training for us coming up in June, I think, with Alexandra.
Hmm.
So we're excited for that. And hopefully that's something that can spread throughout our division and possibly the campus as well. So um, if we don't have any more questions coming in, I would love to thank you again for being a presenter for us today. Um, we're going to put good words into Sherilyn since you mentioned that 1 year temporary, and just let her know how amazing you were today and how we really appreciated you coming in speaking to all of us classified professionals. Remember, attendees, you are able to view these on our professional development YouTube page. So share them with your colleagues, let them know that they exist. Hopefully, this seminar is something that you um, liked and you want to continue classified senate putting on, and that's something that we can definitely look out for the next semester and years going forward. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with, Eric?
Um, I will say this: if you ever see me on campus and you have questions, just tap me on the shoulder, and I'm more than happy to engage in any type of dialogue or any questions you have, or if you have, you want me to help speak at something or anything like that, anything you want to engage in with me, I'm more than open to doing that and welcoming. And even if it was just to say hello, I was at your seminar, and I appreciate that as well. So that's all I'll say. And just thank you so very much for your time and for being here. I really do appreciate it. That's it.
All right. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your Friday afternoon, and you all have a safe and happy weekend.